Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So as Lon mentioned here, I'm Erik Stefferud, the Land Stewardship Operations Manager here for Longwood Gardens. The presentation that I have prepared for you today is land stewardship and the role of prescribed fire on the landscape. So as Lon had mentioned, I do work for relatively prestigious gardens just outside of the Philadelphia area. The property is just over 1,000 acres. About 300 of it is open to the public. And, we really see about 1.5 million visitors every year come through to enjoy our botanical gardens, our formal displays, managed meadow and ecological spaces. And that's really where the role of land stewardship and my team fits into Longwood Gardens as a whole. I'm doing the ecological restoration while also managing a lot of the green infrastructure that we have around the property as well. So before we get, too far into it, land stewardship and fire, that's what we want to, concentrate on today. So we're just going to dive right into it. The first thing that I really need to talk about is the stewardship themes that we have here at Longwood Gardens. It'd be amiss to not talk about how we make these decisions before we actually put fire to the ground, for those reasons. So the first thing that we always really think about is the history and heritage. We're a very old organization. Pierre DuPont started. And so it's very important for us to understand our history of the Brandywine region, but also the history of, our impact on the landscape as well. The next kind of theme that we have is heritage, very, tied tightly into history, but it's really this tradition of stewardship that we have on the landscape, this heritage that we have. We start moving into beauty. Really the biggest thing with beauty is, the aspect is to the eye of the beholder. I'm here today as well as all the other speakers talking about, how we can educate you to learn a little bit more about, the environment and the ecosystems out there. And really what, in my opinion, a lot of the beauty comes from once you understand the things that you're looking at, you learn a little bit more and understand and appreciate that beauty a little bit more. Variety within the living landscape. No two visits to a meadow or the forest are the same. They evolve on a daily basis. The wildlife, believe it or not, doesn't stand in the same spot every single day. You might see a deer one day or a turkey the next, who knows? This is constantly evolving and changing landscape. And, through that is really the inspiration. We are inspired ourselves, and, we are here today, and I'm here today to help inspire you as the, future stewards of the land. And as we keep talking about stewardship is obviously one of our key themes. And, it's really us having this ethical intent of imposing this necessary hand on the landscape. As long as, we can keep going about doing this with that ethical intent, I think we can really make a positive change on the landscape. So as we're talking about stewardship, really what we're doing is stewarding for diversity on the landscape. And diversity on the landscape can be something just as structural diversity, through the herbaceous layer in this forest system, the early successional trees to the mid-overstory, successional diversity, structural diversity, habitat diversity.
Hey, Erik,
yes.
Juan, are the slides advancing?
Oh man, yeah. Sorry, I was looking at the. Oh, whoops. Yeah, I was looking at the wrong screen when I was doing this. All right,
that was pointed out by a Jonathan Stefferud. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Here we go. I got it now. So inspiration. Inspiration. Stewardship. Here we go. Stewardship. Imposing this necessary hand on the landscape. Sorry, I was clicking the wrong buttons there. Going to stewarding for diversity, the structural diversity that I was just talking about, through the forest, the overstory, the midstory, the herbaceous setting. As we get into the habitat diversity as well, here we are in this meadow ecosystem. While a lot of it is relatively dry, we still do have this, mixed wet meadow ecosystem in here. So if we can manage diversity of habitats within, specific ecosystems, we will, really promote that diversity in the long run. So from, that diversity within the ecosystems is the biodiversity, the plant life we have, the structural diversity, the animal diversity that we have. It encourages a greater biodiversity within the ecosystem. My favorite example of really encouraging that biodiversity within the ecosystem is this species-specific example that we have right here with our common butterfly milkweed. Same exact species, but just a little bit of diversity in the leaf structure and the color of the flowers really builds resilience within the landscape. So as we're talking about the diversity, really what we're doing to manage that diversity is managing the succession that we're have in the landscape. So the succession is the process of change in the species structure over the ecological community over time. The time scale can be months, to years, to decades, if you're referring to seasonal crops or something just like a prescribed fire or the successional growth of a forest, or even, millions of years, thinking about extinction and things like that. So, kind of what, looking for succession, we're looking for growth. We're looking to manage the right type of growth for the landscape, managing, our invasive species versus our native species. And really, talking about the succession, our impact is the disturbance. Nature is obviously going to do most of the succession by themselves. Disturbance is, our hand on the landscape. It's what are we doing? It's this landscape scale fragmentation, this edge habitat that we have with a lot of the new communities going in, the destruction of forests and wetlands and meadows, our hand on the landscape mowing, our hand on the landscape using fire. And it's really this, managing succession and our hand on the landscape through disturbance. It's really the scale, the frequency, and the goals that we have in mind. So as we're talking about our goals that we have in mind, the best way for us to start thinking about our goals, evaluating our goals, is this concept of adaptive land management. And through adaptive land management, this is also the framework that we start using, the tools and techniques that we have, or as I like to refer to as building my quiver full of tools. So adaptive land management, is really this framework for setting goals. It gives us a framework for us to ask the right questions, gives us an understanding of outcomes based on past experiences and research, interaction with colleagues, interaction with friends and family, even through situations like this where we get to, ask questions and, see people from different landscapes. And, somebody up in the Allegany might have different management practices than I do down here near Philadelphia, but we can modify and, use all those different experiences together. So it really gives us this opportunity to, ask those right questions, articulate those goals, and develop a plan. So if we go in there, if you write down with your handy pen and pencil on a notebook what your goals are, and develop a plan with the best management strategies, the best monitoring program, you need to assess what you're doing, making sure it's working. If it's not, change something, and then manage adaptively. So, adaptive, another word for flexible, and one of the things that I've always heard a lot is sometimes being flexible is too rigid. You need to be fluid. I've always really liked that. Being flexible isn't always the easiest thing, but it's a good saying that helps keep me moving sometimes. So through, building our quiver, some of the mechanical control methods that we have, hand pruners, hand saws, loppers, string trimmer, chainsaws, we go into mowing, certainly another tool we can use. Chemical control, and certainly a big fan of chemical control on invasive species, but these are all a tool in the toolbox. They're not a cure-all in any one situation. These are things that we can use together, apart, and we need to think about our seasonal timing, our phenology of our plants, and use these as tools within us, articulating our goals, forming a plan, assessing the effects on it. Cultural control is another thing that we're here today talking about. How we can, culturally do things on the landscape. This is the way for us to alter environment to reduce invasive species populations, through sanitation, cleaning your tools, choosing the right plants for your garden, making sure you're not choosing an exotic, exotic species that's going to take over your garden. And really the biggest thing in the cultural control that I like to talk about is really this education factors. We're all here learning today because we have a passion for it, but there's a lot of people out there who just might not know. It's our responsibility to educate the masses. Biological control, while we don't get into it very much, is really releasing a biological into the landscape to take care of an invasive species, such as the rose rosette's disease, mile-a-minute weevil are just two in particular that I'm a little bit more familiar with. But as we're getting into what I really wanted to talk about today, I was trying to blow through a lot of that, is to get into prescribed fire. So I'm going to get into a little bit about today, the history of prescribed fire on the landscape, how we use prescribed fire on the landscape, how we're researching the effects of prescribed fire on the landscape, and some of the supporting functions that I have within my role here at Longwood, as well as my role as a wildland firefighter. So a little bit early historical use. The Native Americans, used it for the same reasons that we do right now: successional plant growth to maintain that, and then clearing for wildlife. Almost the exact same reasons that we use prescribed fire in the landscape, they were using it as well. Early American fire history, we kind of moved a little bit away from fire use through European colonization in really there's not many wildfires in Europe. Well, yes, there are some. They had a little bit of a fear of that fire on the landscape and kind of starting to diminish that. And even a little bit of the effects of smoky bear. While a great practice, we don't want to start wildfires. We definitely want to, make sure that we don't have any mega fires out there. But a little bit of smoky bear sometimes I think scares people sometimes. But as we get into really the fire history on the landscape, so this is a slide that I have to give all credit to Michael Stonebot from the Missouri Tree Ring Laboratory. I witnessed him do a couple of talks about this presentation. You'll see in this picture here. But each one of these tallies on this tree is indicating a wildfire that left a scar on the tree ring. So through a career of Michael's, traveling from Missouri all over the countryside, northeastern Pennsylvania, northeastern United States for that matter, he's collected hundreds, if not thousands, of these tree rings, historical tree rings from all over the country, been able to jigsaw piece and identify all these fire scars in all these trees, based on when did Mount St. Helens erupt and different other major instances across the world that you can see tree scars. And then be able to identify specific wildfires and be able to put an average of when fires occurred naturally on the landscape. So as we're going into the next slide here, just another one that he had put together. I apologize, I scanned this picture this morning, but this is the historical fire intervals of the United States before 1850. So I don't know if you guys can see up here. Sorry, go back one. See up here, I know I'm just in southeastern Pennsylvania. I know Allegany is kind of north central a little bit, but looking at our fire average return interval, naturally occurring wildfires is typically looking about somewhere between every 8 to 15 years or so, which is something that it surprises a lot of people, that we really do have fire on the landscape a lot more present than most people would really think we did. So as we're getting into a little bit of the history of fire in the landscape at Longwood Gardens, I had a lot of fun putting this part of the presentation together, going in a little bit of the fire history here at Longwood. 1985 is a little bit before my time, but it was really exciting finding some of these old articles indicating when fire was on the landscape. So the first prescribed fire use on the landscape that I was able to find at Longwood was in 1985, just through this Longwood Chimes little local magazine that we put out every year. It looks like, we had a couple of year break into 1990, a couple more newspaper articles, a little hand-drawn sketch map right here about where they're burning. And I'll be 100% honest, I've worked for Longwood for 6 years, and I have a vague idea of where I think this map was hand-drawn. So it's, kind of interesting diving into the history, trying to use the historical information to guide my land stewardship, to guide my management, based on very vague ideas that we had from the early 90s, just after I was born, essentially. So as we move into 92 and 93, they burned some more with little to no information, a little sketched out map. 94, who knows? But as we get into 95, we start seeing a little bit more progression of our burning program. Started splitting it out into designated quote unquote burn units. Really helps us manage fire intensity, manage fire behavior, and allows us to have a little bit more safe burn for the firefighters as well. As we get into 96, 97, 98, 99, late 90s, early 2000s, we're still improving this burning program a little bit. We're starting to help with the local county parks, doing some burns in some of their other local places. And we're really starting to engage a lot of the local fire companies, to use this as a training, for wildland firefighting. The training very similarly for prescribed fire is almost identical for the wildland firefighting, which is kind of really where I got my go ahead in this wildland stuff. But as we keep going and, we started expanding outside of some of our more formal managed meadow spaces and in some more of our naturalized meadow spaces, getting us up to about 90 acres for a burn for a single spring, which we did for a few years there. A couple more cool articles, Longwood turns burns into beauty. Just very fun going through the archives, trying to dive into all this old information. 2006, still expanding the program. Land Steward Mike Areno leads the burning. I work with him on a personal level, so it was kind of fun finding out that he actually used to work here. Who would have known? And then 2008, 2009, still had a burning program, but unfortunately, 2010 through 2015, Pennsylvania put a pretty heavy restriction on some of the prescribed fire use. There's a couple of fires through the state that got away that turned into wildfires. We obviously don't want any of that to happen. Safety is obviously always our number one priority. But the Pennsylvania decided it was the time to put more regulations on these. So I started with Longwood in 2013 as a year out of college, just a young buck who wanted to have another adventure. And luckily enough, I was able to find a contract burn boss who was more than willing to come in and help us lead our burns, help train some staff members up, get us appropriately qualified as basic firefighters. And in 2016 brought fire back to the landscape since 2009. And additionally, in 2016, we found some local collaborators to do some burning with. 2017, as you can kind of see from the two maps a little bit here, we're rotating our burn units. We don't want to burn in the same unit every single year. We're concerned that it might have negative effects on the landscape. So fire in the landscape can be good, but maybe sometimes too much fire might be bad. And that's something that we're really asking, wondering, curious, and starting to study. So in 2017 here, we did start doing some different units. And this was our first year that we started doing some burn severity measurements, post-burn severity evaluations, along with burning with some more local collaborators and some sister gardens and partnerships we have. In 2018, again, starting to rotate those burn units around, continuing to do the post-burn severity evaluation, started implementing photo points, continue our training, continue burning with local collaborators. 2019 was really a big year for us, in my opinion. We went from just burning in the 2016 through 2018 in our managed meadow spaces and breaking out into some more of those naturalized meadow spaces that I had mentioned before. So with that, we were able to start get into what would be unit 13, 14, 12, and 17 here on this map. This was really, in my opinion, a first entry burn for these, for getting fire in the landscape. I don't think we've had fire in these select areas since at least prior to 2009. So it was kind of really a success, in my opinion, getting to going into that. In 2009, additionally, we started a third research monitoring program incorporating pyrometers, which are essentially a little heat thermometer that we can put on landscape, which I'll get into here in a little bit. 2020, unfortunately, the COVID, kind of hit us hard like it did a lot of people. And so we unfortunately had to shut down our proning program. But this wasn't until after we actually held a successful training day with all of our local collaborators. We trained up a couple of new firefighters. We got to put a little bit of fire in the landscape and really held an 8-hour, training seminar, which was just absolutely great. And as we're going through, 2020, we're, looking to continue post-burn evaluations. Unfortunately, we didn't get to do that this year. Incorporate some long-term vegetation study plots, put some 10 by 10 blocks out on the landscape, wait for the fire to go through them, look to see what vegetation's there, go back and do that every year. Really curious to see more in-depth, in detail, how the fire affects the different vegetation on the landscape, whether it's our native vegetation or our invasive vegetation. Really looking forward to expanding our pyrometer and ecological studies. And unfortunately, this year I had 6 first entry burns planned for the landscape here at Longwood, and I didn't get to do any of them. So I'm a little upset about that, hoping next year will be a big burn year for us. And then, obviously we still need to continue to train with specific qualifications in mind. I recently just finished my squad boss qualification, and I'm looking forward to becoming a firing boss and then a burn boss. I mean, who wouldn't want a job title with, cool names like that? So here's just a quick bar graph of some of the local collaborators and organizations that we've been burning with. So as you can see, the Flint Woods Preserve in this dark blue is one of our core local collaborators, as well as the Delaware Nature Society, Brandywine State Parks, Mount Cuba Center, Winterthur, Delaware Wildlands, and then obviously Longwood in this baby blue color. So you can see in 2016, when we brought our burning program back, we've recently really started bringing up the number of acres burned in a single year. And so, it's kind of really exciting having this opportunity to have local collaborators who are qualified, trained, and capable to be able to assist with something like prescribed fire. And being able to get more fire on the landscape each year has given us the better opportunity to be able to manage, the landscape elsewhere, not having to spend that much time in it. If we get to burn 30 acres every year or 40 acres every year, that's 40 less acres that, in theory, we need to go back and do different invasive species work. So as I keep mentioning, we're trying to monitor our fire effects. We want to learn what we're doing on the landscape, why the things that we're doing on the landscape are they beneficial? We want to know how beneficial are they and what we can do to make that better. So we need to monitor that and document that. So just the basic broad study objectives that we have here really determine how the seasonal timing, the weather, the fire behavior, and the fire intensity can relate to certain specific invasive species surviving or dying during a prescribed fire. Similarly with native species, we don't want to accidentally hurt our native plants. And really use those results to determine if the prescription, I keep mentioning prescribed fire, it is a prescription for the landscape. We're not putting fire down willy-nilly. People don't go to the CVS and take prescriptions willy-nilly, at least they shouldn't anyway. But this really is a prescription for the landscape, and we want to make sure we're doing the right job for the landscape. We really have a passion for it. We want to take care of it. The other thing we're really trying to do with this is really follow the trends in the plant communities. As I mentioned before, those different invasive species and native species, anecdotal information is just as good as researched information, in the baseline beginning stages of a lot of this. And if we can, have some ideas to benefit our management activities, it would certainly be better than staying stationary, not thinking about it and just doing the same thing over and over and over again. So here it is, to document and analyze both short-term, long-term effects of the activities on our vegetation. So the three specific studies, as you might have figured out that I had before, were this fire effects monitoring, or burn severity transects, this Pyrometer Protocol that I'll get into, and photo documentation as well. So the transects and burn severity, if people aren't familiar with transects, we're more or less walking a north and south line and an east and west line across a burn unit. And we're stopping about every 25 yards, looking at about a 10-yard circle around where we're standing, and we're really looking at the soil, the duff, which is the kind of leafy, fibrous, matted layer in between the soil and the vegetation, the herbaceous layer, obviously, and the woody layer. And so with that, we're really looking at the scorch, how the heat has affected those things, the char, how much they've been burned, from the base layer all the way to the tips and tops of whether it's a small little grass that only sits 2 or 3 inches tall, or rubus, or that might sit 5 or 6 feet tall, or an autumn olive that might be 10 feet tall. It really just kind of depends on what the vegetation is, which we take measurements on all of those different layers. And then obviously consumption of the material. And with that, I'm hoping that over the next 4 or 5 years, we can kind of get some trending information on how the fire has done certain things at different landscapes based on slope, terrain, fire weather, humidity, everything. So as we're getting into the pyrometers are kind of the fun one that I'm really looking forward to, putting across the landscape. And that'll be really those little temperature thermometers that we're putting out in the landscape to see how hot it gets out there. So these pyrometers, I can't take all the credit. A friend of mine, DCNR, gave me these slides a few months ago, but up top on the screen, you'll see what is more or less the 2 copper tags with 6 different colored paints in them. Each of those 6 paints will melt at a different temperature. And so what we're really looking at, after I go back and look for and find all these after the burn comes through, is looking to see what these temperature thresholds were. In particular, this is just my personal opinion, but the nitrogen is really one that we're starting to look at a lot right now. One of the things that our concept is that we've been theorizing is that some of the invasive exotic species, that we plant in the gardens and in our formal spaces, anywhere, they always want more fertilizer and nitrogen, and a lot of our native species, while nitrogen is needed, we don't feel that they need quite as much. And so really putting fire to the landscape to hopefully burn out some of this nitrogen, to deplete some of that, might actually have an effect on reducing some of those invasive species, giving our native species a leg up a little bit. So that's more of just kind of a concept that we argue amongst my department once in a while, but I just like to think about that. But really the other thing that we're getting into with these pyrometers is the placement. So if you can see out in on this slide that I have in front of you, there's a lot of green dots that are spaced equilaterally out across this entire burn unit. This isn't one of mine. This is a DCNR unit that Chad had sent me. And so what we're doing here is putting these little thermometer units out across the landscape. The blue line is obviously the fire edge, perimeter breaks. And what we're doing after we can go back and pick all these things up is see how hot the fire was in different areas. So we can, after we find this information, see those red areas that are a little bit hotter, find those areas that are a little bit bluer, which might be an effect of the slope, north slope versus south slope, potentially with the drainage down the bottom. I don't know. Or it might have an effect to do based on the different vegetation that was present within those areas. And so if we can ideally put some of these thermometer couplings into some of X, Y, or Z invasive species that we want to get rid of, and X, Y, or Z native plant that we want to promote, we can ideally look and hopefully figure out what temperatures burn through those areas, potentially have a long-term study vegetation plot associated with those areas, and monitor those over the course of 2 or 3 different fires and see if the vegetation responds positively or negatively. And with that, we can manage our firing activities to either increase heat or decrease heat on the landscape. So the other one that I really like, this one is really cool looking in my opinion, is this photo documentation. So we're really just using game cameras set up to take a picture at 1 o'clock every day. So this is a pre-burn picture, day after burn picture. There's one of our pavilions there. So one of the things that I want to point out before we get too far here is this bittersweet that you can see in the foreground, this little viney guy in the front. I just like pointing that out to start. 1 week post-burn, you can see things starting to flush up just a little bit here. 2 weeks post-burn, things are starting to get a little bit greener. 3 weeks. And this is the point where you can also see about kind of in this middle ground, there's a couple of trees just on the right-hand side of the screen there. 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. As things are greening up a little bit more, you can see a lot of that bittersweet that got burnt, exotic species that we're trying to manage. Some of these woody species, those trees that I had mentioned that are kind of in the middle ground there, that don't have any leaves on them quite yet. And then you can kind of start seeing a little bit of the milkweeds, I think, coming up there. It's week 7, things are definitely starting to green up a little bit more. And week 8, you can't even tell there was a fire that went through the landscape. And so as I mentioned, the bittersweet right here in the foreground, these couple of trees that are in the middle ground on the right-hand side of the screen, while it looks like 1 or 2 of them leaf back out, a couple of them look like we did get enough fire on them to scorch those out. And that's not the kind of thing that we would go back and cut those out. They're great perching habitat for the birds and the wildlife. There's actually a trail right there. The guests take pictures of meadow larks and every colorful kind of bird you can think of. Sitting on those trees all the time. But really this bittersweet and this management of reduction of invasive species is the thing that I like to see most. What I also think is really cool about this is just in the matter of week 6 to week 7 to week 8, how much the leaf green up in those trees in the background. I just think that's absolutely amazing. It's just a great sight to see. So as I mentioned, we have species of interest that we're monitoring with some of these long-term vegetation plots. We have Elliott's bluestem, Elliott's beardgrass, Andropogon gyrans, which is a Pennsylvania. I believe it's not endangered. I believe it's rare or threatened. Don't quote me on that. But this is one that we've seen amazing positive results, having brought fire back to the landscape, and the spread of this, and the population of this has really been expanding. It's very, very exciting for us to see. Another one that we're, species of interest for us is the yellow thistle. This is one that we're actually trying to not burn because we don't want to potentially have any negative impacts on it. We don't know well enough what to do. Why put a prescription on something that we don't know the answer to? So we're going to hold on to this one and not quite burn this one yet until we understand what the effects are. So I really can't get too far into this presentation without giving a special thanks to all these different partner organizations that we've worked with that have supported the growth of our burning program. The Pennsylvania Game Commission has been integral, the Delaware Nature Society, the Pennsylvania Prescribed Fire Council, which are all members of the PIDCNR, and then Mount Cuba Center, the Nature Conservancy, Silvix, and oh man, I missed the Flint Woods Preserve in there. I'm sorry, Flint Woods people. So, I just want to say thank you to all those people. I'm glad we look like we still got some time here, because I really did want to get the opportunity to show you guys some pretty cool pictures and just a little story of the last few years of where I've been across the country, fighting wildfires in state. Well, I have fought fires in state, but this is more of an out of state kind of deal. But I really just want to show you guys, how big these things can really get.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Some of these pictures are pretty cool.
Cool.
So in Montana in 2016, we were in the Bitterroot Mountains. We were, kind of when we got assigned to the Helena National Forest out in the Lincoln Ranger Station, we fell into the tail end of a large-scale incident. And so we're out there mopping up, gritting through blackened areas to make sure that the fire was truly out, because fire can get down into a hole where a stump was and burn out in some roots and, sit there for 3 or 4, 5, 6 days, up to 2 or 3 weeks, and then could start a fire all over again. So really making sure a fire is out is very, very important for us. So we, our first assignment was going out and gritting, 20 guys deep, just like you see in this top right picture, and looking for smoke, feeling for hot spots, making sure that the fire is out. The next assignment that we had, we got reassigned to a different area within the Bitterroot Mountain Range, to a location that was spec'd for a high fire danger, but they didn't actually have any fires yet, just waiting on that, heat lightning, waiting on that first fire strike. So what we were doing is working with some local guys from the local, DCNR Bureau of Forestry. I forget exactly who it was. And we were working on clearing a lot of these junipers you see in the top from encroaching into some of the rangelands and the cattle ranges that they have there in Montana, which is an increasing, important thing. So we're making all these piles, and then they were going to come back over the winter time and burn the piles down. And this is really just so they have rangeland for their cattle. And here's my squad that we had, that I had there in Montana in 2016, beautiful, beautiful country, had the opportunity to go anywhere. And that's one thing that I can say about prescribed fire and wildfire on the landscape, is that that this job will let you go anywhere and see some amazing, amazing places. So then our third assignment, finally, after doing a couple of days of project work, as you can see in this left-hand picture, you can see smoke just up on the top side of that mountain ridge. So we finally, after doing project work, finally got that call because there was a fire in the area, responded to it, got up to that fire. We had the opportunity to work with some of the local fire aviation resources. You see the helicopter there with the big 100-gallon bucket down on the bottom of it, and just a little blurry picture of the fire that we were working on for a few days before our 14-day assignment was over. In 2017, had the opportunity to go to California in the Plumas National Forest, Northern California. So as you can see in this bottom panoramic picture, we had kind of this big crew camp, and all of that, while you might think it might just be California haze, that was actually smoke coming up from all the fires that were up in the mountains right around us. So we got there initially to find out that we got moved to night shift, because believe it or not, fires are usually a little less intense. In the evenings, the temperature goes down, the humidity goes up, the fire usually has a little bit less fire intensity. We were looking at 95 to 100 degree days in California, and we were looking at evenings that dropped into the 50s or 60s. And so we really had a great opportunity to go in. Our first assignment was going in and putting out spot fires outside of the main body of the fire in the middle of the night. It was so exciting. And then, we put out some spot fires. The next couple of days, we ended up working with the local interagency hotshot crew. We were the holding resources for them while they were burning off this fire line, more or less burning off this gorge, and we burned off like 600 acres that night, putting fire on the ground to fight fire with fire kind of thing. So there's just a couple of clips. The top left one is the evening. We're going in to fight the fire as they were starting ignitions. Pretty dark as, fire rolled through the night. And here's the smoky picture on the right the next morning as we're waiting to get ready to go to bed during the day. We were a little tired after a long days of work that day. So we did have the opportunity after we got reassigned off of night shift onto day shift to a different active part of the fire. We were holding this roadside, as you can see in the top right picture. We held the roadside for a while. Top left picture, we started calling in the aerial resources to stop dropping the buckets off. And as you can see in the bottom there, we were really working that whole entire road line down to where all those pickup trucks are and all the tree lines. So we really had the opportunity to stand on a road and fight fire. It was a lot of fun. We did have to back off, like I said, and as you can see with those aerial resources there, once we needed a little bit of help, but it's all part of the plan. There's thousands of people working these incidents. And it's amazing, you know, how well-oiled machine these things can be sometimes. So after we got done working that hot piece of the fire, we were about a day or two before we were getting ready to get sent back to Pennsylvania. And as you can see here, we're, you know, kind of monitoring some of the fire breaks up on top of these mountain ridge lines, you know, looking at the blackened area on the right-hand side, the green area on the left-hand side, really just making sure, as I, you know, said before, that the fire is out, because the last thing we need is our names on something saying that it's out and have that fire spark back up again and start another fire. And that would just not be good. So Northern Idaho in 2018, had the opportunity to go to Northern Idaho, Bonner Ferry Ranger Station, which was super fun about Northern Idaho. You can see my crew boss there in the center picture. The ridge line in the far distance there is actually Canada. So we were fighting fire so far north into Idaho that we actually ended up fighting fire into Canada. And so, you know, we were in this very, very remote region of Northern Idaho, so close to Canada, where we were, you know, you can see my sleeping bag right there. I didn't even set my tent up. You know, we were so close to the fire. We moved so frequently, sorry, that I got tired of setting my tent up and I didn't even bother doing it anymore. You know, sleeping outside under the stars in Northern Idaho, it was absolutely majestic. You know, a nice little bed of pine down was all I needed. So, you know, as we were in Northern Idaho, we're kind of in the middle of nowhere. We had the opportunity to do some chainsaw training. We had the opportunity, as always, you know, keeping our tools and equipment as sharp as possible. So I do have one video here on this helicopter. This is actually, you know, as I mentioned, we were very far away from civilization. We're about 65 to 70 miles away from the nearest road, you know, hard road. Sorry, we were working off of a lot of forestry roads up in the mountainside. So we got our food delivered via helicopter. So I warn everybody who has their volume up really loud that this is a loud video. Yeah, so that, I'll tell you what, was awesome to have, you know, meals getting delivered every day via helicopter. I mean, I know going and getting takeout right now is kind of the thing, but man, if I could order a helicopter full of food every day, that would be the story. So, you know, as I continue here, going into the spring of 2019, I had the opportunity to go to Oregon as part of a prescribed fire training exchange program. As I mentioned, I'm now currently a qualified squad boss, and it was going through this training that I finished my formal training as a squad boss and had the opportunity to get that qualification. So it was super exciting getting this opportunity. And where I went to Oregon with individuals from probably 30 or 40 different resources across the world who came together for this, you know, prescribed fire training. Collectively, we ended up working with a lot of local agencies, a lot of local Bureau of Forestry personnel, and we ended up burning, I think they told us, about 1,500 acres collectively over the course of 10 days. Around some of the high fire danger, high risk areas around Deschutes National Forest, the Three Sisters area, all the local towns, as well as doing ecological burning as well. So it was so much fun to really get to learn about this. The one thing that I really want to point out of these three individuals that you'll see here in this picture, the individual with the orange hat, he was actually a hotshot from Washington State. The individual in the white hard hat is actually an individual who works for an Alaskan helicopter attack crew. So Alaskan wildfire hill attack crew, which was just amazing to work with him. And the guy in the green hard hat, oddly enough, runs a prescribed fire burning program in Sweden. So being, you know, Erik with a K, you know, we were all about, you know, that Viking life. So it was just amazing getting to, you know, kind of talk to all these individuals from the country, let alone the world, of their experiences with prescribed fire and come together as a training. So here's just another video that I have for you guys real quick. And it's the last one, I think. And it is a video that I took from the dash cam when we were working in Burn the one day. I was driving the engine, so other people were spraying water, holding the fire brake, while other people were doing ignitions. So this is just kind of a cool little video showing how we do ignitions in a time lapse across the landscape. You'll notice that they're walking about 10 to 15 feet away from where it's actively burning, only sending a little bit of active fire back into the blackened area at a time. As I mentioned before, we can manage those fire intensities and heat thresholds based on the distance that we can, start these ignitions, or the closer together or the further together, we allow for more heat buildup before it burns into the black. So it's just very interesting. I think this is a great opportunity to really see this. I'm actually going to play it again. I like this video that much. So you see him coming across, the fire builds up, it gets really hot, and then it hits the black and goes out. So you can imagine if that spacing was a little bit lower, the fire intensity wouldn't build up very much. Or if that spacing was a lot larger, the fire intensity would build up even more. And so that's where I'm getting at with this whole understanding these invasive species, understanding the heat thresholds that we might be able to manage these invasive species at, and be able to manage our firing techniques to be able to have the best effect on the landscape, desired effect on the landscape that we're looking to have. I keep saying that it's a prescription for the landscape, and that's exactly what we want to do with it. Is we want to prescribe the landscape, and we want to keep it, make it as healthy as we can. So with that, I'm going to leave it for questions. That kind of ends my presentation. I'd love to see if you guys have anything that you're curious about.
Yeah, Eric, that was phenomenal. Again, I'm a huge Longwood Gardens fan, and it's great to see you when I get a chance to get there. Look forward to coming back. If anybody has questions, unmute. We can take a couple questions. We've got a hard stop in a couple minutes, but if you have some questions, feel free to unmute and ask Eric.
What impact does the prescribed burning have on the atmospheric conditions and the air?
So I know, I don't exactly know a lot about that. I know, in spaces out west, there is certainly a big question about air quality in these long-term fires. Specifically when they start burning things like trees and logs that'll burn for weeks and weeks and days on end. Most of the burning that I do here at Longwood is really ecological warm season grass burns. And so the smoke is really dissipated within an hour. And so, we really don't have a large impact on smoke and air quality. That being said, we are in the greater Philadelphia region. And so I can only burn within my area on, I believe it's moderate to high, forecast weather, air quality forecast days. So sorry.
Thank you.
Eric, I'm going to pass along a question from Anne. She is in the chat, and asks, what equipment is being used to ignite fire?
So we use a drip torch. So a drip torch, you can Google it, find plenty of pictures, but it really looks like a watering can that we use a mixture of diesel fuel and gasoline. Gasoline has a lot more vapor than diesel does, but diesel burns longer than gasoline. And so this kind of mixture helps us ignite things, but it's really a watering can with a little flaming wick out one side, and we just pour a little bit of fuel, just little drops of fuel, those little strips that we saw in those videos. If you Google a drip torch, I would definitely recommend. Or if you really want to see some of the fun tools that we can do, that I've seen on large scale incidents, would be a pyro shot, which is more or less a paintball gun that shoots little napalm grenades. Those are pretty cool. And then there's also ones that mount to helicopters that will drop really big, ping pong balls full of napalm out into large scale burn units. So there is a large scale thing that you can get up into, and flamethrowers and terra torches and whatnot. But drip torch is really the main used one across the nation.
Hey, Eric, if I have time, the pyrometer, are you placing that just on the ground surface, or do you raise it up just above the ground? Like, where are you getting a temperature reading from?
Yeah, so great question. So we are actually, the protocol that we have, or was recommended from DCNR to us, is about 10 to 12 inches off the ground. If it's too close to the ground is insulated so well that we might not get accurate temperature reading. So we do need to get that off of the ground just a little bit. Good question.
Hey, Eric.
Yes.
Hi, it's getting back to Longwood.
Mm-hmm.
It was amazing how quickly the vegetation returns. Question, if you do a burn, like say in a square area, do you start the fire on all four sides, all perimeters at the same time?
No, there's definitely a lot of factors that would go into where we'd start a fire. Really, the two biggest factors are slope and wind direction. Typically, we would always start on the downwind side or the upslope side, and typically start on one corner.
One corner.
That way we can start on one corner and go all the way around and tie into the end. If we start on 4 corners and there's 4 fires burning, right? We want to keep 1 fire burning so we can manage the entire time, rather than 4 fires that might have different fire behaviors and activities.
Okay, I was just wondering about the wildlife, like the rabbits and the fox, if they have an area to get out.
Yeah, and so that's really, if we start on, say the upper right tip and we burn in the circle all the way down to the lower left tip, you could say, I think I have my lefts and rights mixed up, but by burning it slowly, we create one single flame front going slowly across the entire unit without actually, kind of circling them in.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm just going to say thank you very much, Erik. That was great. We're going to have to continue on. We've got a program coming on right after yours about the study of insects and for education purposes, kind of resurrecting dead specimens for a collection. And we got frogs at 1 o'clock, digital wildlife photography at 2, fungi at 3, a live fungi walk. A live bird walk at Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge in Western New York State. And at 7 o'clock tonight, we have our last keynote speaker with Dr. Erik Olson talking about pollinators. So Erik, really appreciate you being here, and looking forward for me personally to coming back and experiencing Longwood. So
Great.
Thanks.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for everybody for showing up today.
Yeah, and real quick, go to longwoodgardens.org, and there's tremendous information there about about Longwood Gardens. What a beautiful place! And I grew up in Rochester. Coming from Rochester down here, my parents made it a point to take me here in the 1970s. So now, luckily, I moved here, and I'm only 20 minutes away. So it's great. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks.